Here's our subject, a 4-level terrace house in Sydney. So when I say 3-point perspectives, what are the 3 points? Well, the most obvious is the vertical point. And it can be seen that these two lines will converge some reasonable way off camera. So that's one of the points of perspective. And we can see that there is a vanishing point going off just off the paper. And we can also see that there is another vanishing point where the perspective angles converge off to the left of our paper. And where is eye level? Eye level is where we actually get a horizontal line should there happen to be some sort of line on our subject at that point. So this line is still sloping down slightly, but these lines are sloping up. So eye level is going to be something in between, and it's probably about here. And that looks right, level with where the camera was when I took this photo. But how do we draw this freehand? We're not going to be setting up some sort of 3-point perspective exercise framework with eye level and vanishing points plotted. We're going to draw this directly in ink by looking at it and just plotting and estimating as we go. I'm going to start with this line here and then move up and move down. I'm going to leave this section till last because I find it easier to get the often more complicated ground level section of the building done when the rest of it is drawn. We have a better sense of scale. Let's start. So this section now is all about getting the angles as accurate as I can and getting the proportions between these major horizontal and vertical lines as close as I can to what's in my reference. I'm going to keep refining these lines as I draw whenever I notice they've got a little bit out of kilter, because drawing them in separate sections can make it harder to get a nice straight line when it comes to these columns, but we really want them to line up really precisely. It's a fairly dominant visual impact of this scene, so we want to keep these columns dead straight on top of each other as we can, following the perspective angles that we want in this 3-point perspective view. So I've roughed in the grid that we have here. The proportions would look slightly different on my paper when I actually put width to the columns and so forth. But I wanted to find now in this same very light, scratchy way the distance that the veranda goes back to where it meets the actual front of the building, and then establish where the balconies come to and also where the windows that we can see are. So let's go. Adding these balconies helps me look again at the gap now between the top of the balcony and the ceiling of each section. So that helps me work out, are they quite in the right place? Or can I make a little more adjustment still before I firm up exactly where these major horizontal and vertical lines will be? And I start to show some of the decorative elements as well and see if their spaces work out the way I want in reference to the photo. Although I'm not wanting to get bogged down with detail just yet, I do need to establish a little bit of detail just to get a sense of the scale and the proportions of the spaces which are left around the detail. But in fact, I do start to add a bit of the detail because they do change how we define the spaces that they enclose. So there's a fair bit of decoration on these verandas, and particularly with these railings, these cast iron railings, where these ornate wrought iron designs really, well, we can really only suggest them. We can't put all the detail that's there. We just want to create the effect of the pattern. I really mess up those 3 windows where I place them, and I spend a fair bit of time now trying to slide them, or at least that center one, slide it slightly to the left so it doesn't look quite so out of place. And I think it was possible to do that a little bit by careful use of shadows and where the emphasis lies because of that. So I get this upper lacework, as we call it, done, and then suggesting the pattern in this veranda railing. You can see what I mean by suggesting the pattern rather than trying to draw it creating the effect rather than the exactness of it. It's a great skill to develop when we like drawing architecture. It's the same principle we use drawing trees. We draw the effect of the leaves, we don't actually draw the leaves. So I do another balcony railing and then get this top part also done. Looking at my proportions of these squares, it gives me a chance to compare them with the reference and think, have I got the proportions right? Is the ratio height to breadth accurate? Always good to note this and keep it as a reference for next time. We might just add these leaves at the top and put these dormer windows on as well before we get distracted by the street level section. I'm a great fan of these overhanging tree branches. They're pretty common in Australia, certainly when we take photos, because we mostly have trees in our streets. So it's really easy to include them. And I always like the contrast they give to the lines of the architecture, the lines of the leaf work, the shapes, the form of the leaf work, often the opportunity to have a nice dark tonal value up there against the white of the sky. I find there are so many aspects of a little bit of overhanging tree in one of the top corners that really add a lot of life and drama, I think, to our view of the building, that I think it's always good to do if we can. So now coming down more and starting to get to this street level floor, which will have more detail than was in the upper floors and has a little more impact in terms of what we're looking at when we see the drawing. It's important to get all of these horizontal bands of architectural elements that line up horizontally, get them all on the perspective lines that we need. All these little decorations on the columns must all line up. So now I've mapped out this lower section to complete before my pen dries out completely, I hope, and then we'll get the ground level section done. Notice how I'm continually slightly adjusting perspective angles by adding additional lines on and firming up the ones which are closest to what I want. That's one of the reasons I think I can have fairly accurate perspective. Not because I draw it that way first time, but I keep drawing it till I eventually get it right. And I find that looks less disruptive than having the lines in the wrong place. We certainly shouldn't be afraid of making mistakes, and we shouldn't be alarmed when we do, because we will make mistakes. It's important to develop a healthy attitude, because that will help us to respond to mistakes that we might make in the most productive, effective way. And we usually can at least pull back the effect of any errors that we make. I particularly pay attention when I start to position these ground floor windows and the doorway, having learnt my lesson with the windows above, to try and make sure that they're centered a little more accurately. My problem when I did the floor above with those windows was that I positioned them according to the poles off the reference. I should have just looked at the space in my drawing and positioned them equally across the center of that floor. So that's my take home. That's what I'm going to remember next time. Sometimes it's better to not reference the photo so carefully or the image, but to actually reference what will work for whatever proportions and measurements you've actually drawn on the paper, because no one's going to be comparing it to the reference at the end. Well, no one but all of you people with my drawing, of course. So now I finished this lower section. As you can see, my reference photo is actually two photos roughly stuck together. And I will include these on my community page if you'd like to have a go drawing this 3-point perspective scene yourself. So I'm just finishing this, and then I'm going to start to think about the tone. So that should be a lot of fun, because I think this should really pop in 3 dimensions with the tone on. Just finishing all the street level details, which sometimes aren't as interesting, and in this case they're probably not as interesting as the rest of the building, but they still have to be done. They still have to be there, so we need to make the effort. They're part of the context of what we see. So here we have the line work finished, and I think this is the sort of subject where a little bit of tone can really pop the three-dimensionality of it. Whereas I think it would be both time consuming and a bit confusing to try and hatch the same effect we could achieve far more easily and quickly and effectively using marker tone. So I'm going to do that now. But the important thing is that at every point, even when we're doing these floorboards of the balconies, that we look at where our main perspective lines are, that we look at where our main perspective angles are, which we've positioned somewhat more carefully, and then we quickly spread, if you like, the angle that we have to achieve slowly, bit by bit, with every line. And if I don't have heavier lines such as these supporting beams to put in, I will often just look at it and carefully position a few lines, 2 or 3 lines across the length that are at the right angle, so that as I approach them, I can be changing the angle slightly so that it's the right one when I hit that line. And I'll use my marker tone color chart to help me make a better choice faster. Now for the tone work, I'm using my Copic sketch markers. I'm using the brush end, and I'm using the pens from N0, N for neutral grey, N0 to N4, but most of the work is being done with N1, N2 and N3. So I'm mostly just pushing back and forth. At this stage, I'm not overly worried too much exactly what my pens are. I'm using lighter, darker or mid ones, but the important thing when we're doing values is that we reference off what we've done. We keep looking back and seeing, are the darkest bits still the darkest bits, or have I put a bit much mid-tone on, so I've shifted the balance and I need to go darker to create the relative values from one area to another, because that's what it's really all about, the relative values that we see. I'm working hard to keep these columns not getting any tone on them, but I end up slopping them a bit, or maybe it just bled through after I finished. So after I finish the tone, I do something I have never ever done with any of my drawings before. So just wait and have a look at that. It's also important to remember to add some tone behind the wrought iron railings as well. But we don't want to totally overwhelm the rails. We still want some sense that they're still there in front of the shadows that are behind. So as I often say, it's back and forth, back and forth. And so finally with the markers, I have another look overall at the drawing and I work out, are there any final adjustments I want to make? And this is particularly where I often put my darkest darks in, because I've now got pretty much the whole thing to view, and I can work out, where have things got a bit too much mid-tone, where there's not quite enough contrast. Where do I want to put the darkest tones in? Do I want to go one tone darker than I've gone in the past? And this is where I actually used a bit of N4 as my darkest tone. And then I get the bottle of white ink that I bought ages ago and have never actually used to redefine my columns, because either I slopped tone over them or it bled through after I put the tone next to them. But either way, having these columns nice and white is a fairly important part, I think, of the visual drama of this view. And when I look at this now, of course, I can see that I haven't got the angles of these columns sloping as much to the left as they do in the reference. However, the actual drawing itself looks okay, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. I think too that extreme left-hand third could be a bit narrower if I was able to wave a magic wand. And these are all the things that it's good to note when we've finished, so that we can have a sense of resolve next time we draw, just to foreshorten a little tighter and to check the vertical angles more precisely. If you'd like to have a go doing this yourself, I'll post these on my community page. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hope you've enjoyed watching this, and I hope you have fun having a go drawing it yourself. I'll see you next time. Bye.